I'm Emily Lutzker.
And I'm Anna Kamasia.
Your tax-deductible donation makes this podcast possible. Please support us at internationalarrivals.org.
Today, International Arrivals speaks with Helina Metaferia, an interdisciplinary artist based here in New York City. She works across performance, video, installation, collage, and social engagement. Part of the Ethiopian diaspora, her work speaks to intersectional identities and often overlooked histories and narratives. Welcome, Helina.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And as we were saying to you, this is our first live podcast in P&T Studio Podcast. You've had a busy year. You've had a very busy year. This year, you had work at the Sharjah Biennial, University of Maryland, Baltimore County Art Gallery, First Art Museums, which was Multiplicities, Blackness in American Collage, with Nugent Smith was also in that show, who we interviewed here on the podcast. The Lumber Room in Portland, Institut Français of Casablanca, Tufts, Cadiz in Paris, and an exhibition for Four Freedoms. And that's only a handful of the exhibitions you've had this year. So how does it feel to be back in New York City?
It feels great. New York is home. I live in Harlem and I get my work done here. And I'm happy to be spending a little bit more studio time in the winter season.
Amazing. Are you from New York? Did you grow up here?
I was born in DC and grew up in Maryland. So technically the DMV, like many Ethiopian Americans, we have a huge population, the largest outside of Ethiopia and DC. And that's where I grew up. And I've lived all over the country since.
Yeah, I was reading about that today, about the Ethiopian diaspora. And my little nuggets that I found out was that the first wave of Ethiopian immigrants came to the U.S. between 1941 and 1974. There was about 20,000 of them coming here to pretty much achieve higher education and conduct diplomatic missions sent by the president. And then, sort of in the 1990s and until 2002, during the Eritrean-Ethiopian War, there was about 5,000 Ethiopians coming here to the U.S. every month. And now there's over 200,000 members of the Ethiopian diaspora, those who identify as part of it in the U.S. So tell us your story and your connection.
Yeah, I think the statistics might be even greater just for the DC area. I've read, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've read something around 250,000 just in the DC metropolitan area, which is where I was born and raised. And my family, I was born in Washington, DC. So my family is that first wave that you discussed.
Mm-hmm.
My mother came to DC she came to the US in 1969, and my dad in 72. And that has allowed me to have the perspective that they have of this sort of romanticized time before Haile Selassie, the former, I would say, emperor of Ethiopia, was overthrown, and before a lot of different, turbulent times occurred within the country's history. So I have this very removed idea of what it means to be an Ethiopian person. It's not contemporary by any means. I've visited a handful of times, but my introduction to that culture is really an oral history that I've been told through my family and from the people that I know around me that I grew up with.
And that kind of feeds into your project By Way of Revolution, I think, or it's a project I wanted to talk about, because as you've described it, it creates space for exchange and communion between those amongst BIPOC women, femme-identifying women who have historically been overlooked in relation to their political and activist labor, but also because this work has strong ties with your family history. No?
Yes. Yeah, I can elaborate more. Yeah. My mother, who passed away almost 8 years ago now, she was an Ethiopian women's rights activist, working as an expat with all the benefits that she had to have it, her position here in the U.S. On behalf of Ethiopian women's issues and human rights issues with an organization that she had founded. And a lot of the quote unquote aunties that I grew up with that she raised me with in a village we're sometimes on the front line of some of that heavier activism work in Ethiopia and came here as refugees. So she was in the middle of writing a memoir when she passed, which has since been published posthumously with the support of my dad and my family about all this activism work. And before she had gotten that archive out, I really started to think about women's contributions that are often overlooked to human rights issues, to activism and social progress. Some of that labor can look very invisible in the form of organizational support, emotional labor, the behind the scenes work. And so I wanted to foreground contemporary Black and BIPOC female identifying activists. And that has been the nugget of my work definitely since 2018. Also very influenced by state of events happening in this country. And my father also teaches political science at a historically Black college, Morgan State. So I was inundated with politics from a young age between the two of them. And so I am like the brainchild of them. But I found my own way through it. I always thought I would resist that kind of heady, intellectual, and often sacrificial labor by engaging in something much more creative and expressive. And so I went into the arts, and then here I am full circle, tackling some of those same issues with the urgency and passion that I adopted from a young age.
But I think that that's really interesting in relation to your work too, because of kind of your own engagement with history, but also with archives, and not just archives as a space for research, but also creating your own archives. And I think that's obviously a theme that comes through in a lot of your work. And so, I'm interested in how you sort of your own interest in archives, but also how archives function theoretically in your work, because you disrupt archives, you reveal their limits, you insert personal narratives into existing archives. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that.
And just to add a little bit, just for context for our listeners, maybe because you use this word archive, tell us a little bit about how you find it different from history or artifacts.
Yeah, these are good questions. I would speak to the existing repository, documentation, any form of collected knowledge that has been stored and accessible to the public domain is the point of interest for me. And sometimes I am also working with more private archives or some archives that haven't found documentation yet, such as oral histories or embodied knowledge and wisdom that gets passed on much more casually between people, conversationally. I'm also interested in what's secretive, what's omitted, what hasn't been found of value or importance to be documented. So I'm looking at the imperfection of the archive. And I guess that integrates this sort of scholarship side that I have to my practice, a very research-based practice, being a professor and also being somebody who is simply just a lover of the book and a lover of ways in which traditionally books are formed, such as words or images, but also I feel like the book can be us. It can be our bodies. It can be the way we move in the world. We document so much through technology and through our phone, but I'm documenting all the time with my eyes. I'm looking around right now and just taking mental notes and seeing this beautiful studio that you guys are working out of and all of you, and just kind of connecting and staying present. And that too, as long as my memory will serve it, is such a beautiful archive. I further became so interested in the archive because I was working, I started as a painter, and then I started working with performance and video and, trying to document these ephemeral moments that I was creating using my body and time, that if it wasn't documented properly, it's as if it never existed. And so then I had so many archives of my own body laying around of just photos and videos. And so I started working with those still images, and I started to collage them with archives that I would be afforded to find when I was on the residency circuit at different locations. So that's how I started working with collage. out of a performance and media-based practice. And then it quickly became, as the more I traveled, the more I was invited to do different projects, I was just exposed to so many different types of ways in which just basically libraries and places that people really house information. And so I started to critique, particularly in my Refiguring the Canon series, particularly in that series, I was critiquing art history and Western canons. And in the By Way of Revolution project, when I was at Michigan State University as a visiting professor and artist in resident, I had exposure to a really large library, special collections of what was considered radicalism.
Mm.
And I was very much interested because there was everything on the left and everything on the right. And some of it was just like travel posters to Ethiopia was considered radical. And I was like, what librarian or what archivist decided that this, or who donated this specific to this
radical.
connection? And so Kenyan and South African travel posters were also considered radical. And so then I realized it was all made up. This idea of radical and what is and what isn't, and what change looks like, and what's scary, and what's on the edge and on the periphery of acceptable status quo could just be being Black or being African. So this series was born out of the critique of that fear, really, that fear of the other, of change. And then also simultaneously documenting those who are living, who are present, who are making disruption in the world, and who are instilling that fear and being fearless.
Wow. What a minefield. Like, really.
Yeah.
Maybe for our listeners, you could talk a little bit more about By Way of Revolution and just give them a little bit of description of what those works are and how you use collage in the archive.
I began the series By Way of Revolution starting in 2018, again, when I was at Michigan State University as an artist in residence and exposed to this beautiful archive of what was considered radicalism. And at the time, I was still very much mourning my mother's death. It had only been a couple years. And so I was thinking a lot about wanting to be of service because that was her love language. That was the way she operated in the world, and was very tireless in what she gave to community and to her country as an expat. And so that, coupled with what was happening politically in the US at the time, made me want to move with urgency. And the way that I work in the studio is my ideas often surpass my physical making discipline. So I will start with painting and I'll move quickly into performance. I'll go right into performance and then I'll say, oh, this should be a sculpture. And so the way that I keep up with it is I have many things happening simultaneously, but always through a project that can take up to a decade or more to make. I feel like By Way of Revolution has the leg span, especially what's happening internationally and nationally in this country. It can continue and continue. And because people are responding and receiving the work the way they are, I know that it is of service. I know that it is doing the work. And I may not be on the front lines of any particular movement, but I'm witness and I'm holding space for others who are. And so what the project looks like physically is it can look like a series of collages, headdresses that expand from Black women and brown women who participate in my workshops or who people on the front line. Some of them are in the front line of today's modern social justice movements, Black Lives Matter chapter leaders and co-founders, activists, journalists. And then there's also people who are everyday folks who participate in a social practice workshop that I engage them with. And I've done these around the country in partnership with various organizations and institutions. And then I will do a deep interview process with them, and I will engage in further research with research assistants at libraries around the country and internationally that house these sort of activism repositories. And then I will, with their agreement, I will collage their image with these archives of history, and it begins to adorn them in the ways that often visually look like representation from my ancestral homeland. I'm looking at headdresses and crowns as these symbols and motifs for liberation that have been used since we fought off a colonial system, in the 1800s and again in the 1900s. And I'm looking at also ways in which one group of people and their liberation story inspires social justice in another group of people that are directly around the world. And so ways in which the Ethiopian defeating Italians had inspired so many other revolutions, the ways that African American civil rights movements have inspired people around the world for social justice. And what was happening in South Africa is, in the hearts and the minds of people that are living in Latin America, and what's happening in Palestine is in the hearts and minds of everyone around the world who are seeking justice in their own ways. And so these things are not disparate. They are all interconnected. And so underneath it all, there's a human story. And the story is about love, it's about unity, it's about connections, and it's about legacy and preserving that. And I try not to do it in a romantic way. It's definitely it's a story that has its flaws. It's the stories that's imperfect. It's unfolding, but that's a part of it. So there's the collage work. There's performance art where I'm wearing crowns etched with this sort of archival material and embodying it with wearable sculptures. And there's video and other forms. But through all of it, whether it's a object or an ephemeral, experiential, time-based occurrence, the through line for me is bodies, conversations, and archives.
What would make you kind of in the studio working, what would make you decide, hey, this should be a performance. It needs to be presented live to people rather than represented, rather than a, physical artifact?
Well, I think I love both and I love all. I think the language of activism is so much about immediacy. So performance lends itself to the ability to shout, to sing, to scream, and to take up space, and to use bodies in organized ways, in organized fashion that look like a protest. And so for me, that can look like a processional, or it can look like a performance in which all of those materials and more, texts, et cetera, are incorporated in a way to galvanize action through a spectacle, through an attention-seeking method that necessarily isn't saying, hey, look at me, but hey, look at this. And so that has been a tactic for me. Sometimes social practice or engagement workshops are a way to do this in privacy. I never film these workshops. I'm always keeping that private for the participants. So if there's 30 people there, 30 people get to experience that and hopefully build connections and community with each other. And then they can be photographed after in a very much a way where they understand the camera as a tool for reclaiming one's image in a way that when media and press and all kinds of ways want to disrupt how the story is told, and we want to make sure we're archived and we're presented in the ways. And it's very much a strategy that has been used historically across different organizing groups. So the way I choose the medium is like, what does this particular moment require? What is this show? What could it benefit from? And I love the object because once the hoopla is done, there's something there. There's something as a record for people to look at.
And the archive of a performance is never the same as being there, so then you have the artifact from the thing that was so immediate, which is never as powerful as, as the lost moment.
Yes. It's the experience is us being in this room right now and having this conversation. It will be recorded.
Yep. We're creating an archive, right?
We are creating also a performance of sorts, a social engagement of sorts.
Yeah.
And we will know what the temperature feels like. We will know, the people walking outside the windows and the things that are happening there, but the audience won't. And so whether it's of relevance to them or not, they're getting the secondhand experience of this moment right now. And so it's something to be said for that. And the other thing is that we all have so many different perspectives. So a lot of time, my studio practice or post-studio practice is spent listening and relating and finding ways in which the everyday experience that we engage in can also be art. It doesn't have to be a science or precise, or there's no judgment. It's just an art.
But it's also about validating in so many ways too. To just listen to somebody tell their story or to spend time with somebody, I think it validates their existence, it validates their own experiences, their own lives, all of those things. And I think that's an important part of being in this world too. But I think it's an important part of your practice too, in gathering and listening and witnessing people's experiences.
Yeah, and to what does it take to create spaces where people are willing to be vulnerable, and to share, and to not have to be so guarded where we miss that we're living human beings, and we're recognizing and respecting each other in the space. I think, we are so desensitized from suffering and struggle in a chaotic world, in a busy city like New York, all over the planet. I think we've relied on technology, and we relied on other things to fill the void. But there is something about human presence that is really still very moving and compelling. And I think I don't have any answers to how to solve all the world's problems, but I think that it's one gesture towards a possibility.
I think so too. And I think it's really important at this moment when I see so many people disconnecting from actual human contact or connection or being with people. I mean, we can all talk about social media, but I think that it's a real barrier. And I think connecting with people is so important.
I think we're nicer to each other when we're in person.
Maybe. I wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit, and I wanted to ask about an older work, which is Home Free, which, according to your website, quote, addresses the longing for a physical and psychic home in a time of increased forced migration, whether through the affordable housing crisis in urban centers internationally, immigration laws, or other political social reasons, end of quote. And this work makes use of material for building homes, along with the visual language of maps and movement. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the impetus for this work and the overlapping spheres of homemaking and mapping.
Yeah, so again, my whole practice is really devoted to archives, bodies, and conversations. So I'm thinking through figuration sometimes there's no figuration, there's simply the remnants of archives. And in the Home Free exhibition and series, the archive was parts of building materials that were no longer functioning as building materials. So they were used and found and repurposed all over different sites, and then brought together in these formations of different sculptural elements that look like abstraction or look like amulets. I'm always referencing parallel to an art history, Western art history, which I was trained and which I still teach as a professor, an African art history and sensibility, especially an Ethiopian sense of art history, where objects aren't as precious. They are precious, but they're not so precious that you can't touch them. And so the idea that wooden flooring or bricks or soil or dust or dirt could be art, could be material for art, and could be displayed on a pedestal or in a gallery or museum in a reconfigured way. That to me was the poetry of making things that were accessible, but building an archive of what was out of what was probably going to be discarded. And so that was that project. And I activated all that through performance art, through performative photos and videos as well. And it was another form of not just, I would say, archiving, but another form of painting with materials. I'm always genre bending here.
Mm-hmm.
It was another way of collaging in the sense of assemblage, if you can think of that as a form of collage. So I think another through line in my practice is organizing. That is so important to me, as maybe that's the activist side of my background, but organizing as an artistic and political act. So that means gathering people or gathering objects, gathering archives or gathering, I don't know, like connections and organizational institutions. I'm doing so many things now across institutions where I'm bringing institutions together and rethinking what their mission is if it's supposed to be for the public, then maybe it's not. So these individual egos have to be sort of released in order to make a greater impact in a community. So if you give me disparate, things 2 and 2, I'm going to find a way that they can come together to make 4, and that was also evident in that body of work.
I think it's also, I also see that it's about reclamation and making space for these issues too. Mm-hmm. That I think recuperation, that's part of what you're doing too, is recuperating these stories and reclaiming these stories and these narratives, whether they're oral stories or whether they're stories that are documented through photographs. So I think that seems to be part of what's happening too.
Yeah, again, going back to the book, like the book can be anything. It can be
Yes.
us. It can be this moment. It's interesting. Working on a project now with Center for Book Arts, so I'm thinking a lot about what the book is and what it isn't. But creating new stories out of old ones. That is something I'm really interested in, and that is also like a social science or psychology sort of question too, right? Because once you start working in social practice, you're dibbling and dabbling in all kinds of different humanities because it all has to do with people in the real world. So, how do we
Exactly.
tell these stories and how can we make new ones, even out of the painful ones, even out of the trauma, even out of the moments in our bodies that we've stored as this like genetic. I'm really interested in epigenetics and just sort of like the ways in which trauma gets stored in the body, right? And movement as a methodology for releasing that trauma. And so those are some things I'm grappling with. But when I was purely a painter, I couldn't get at the content. When I was just doing performance, I was dissatisfied with the result. But when I started to mix it all together, I said, aha, so the art is actually bigger than the object or the thing. It has to speak to people and breathe to people, and sometimes it has to come in other forms in different ways.
Yes, so true.
But I keep thinking about a few things
Yeah.
as you're talking. And one, I don't know if you know of the theorist and philosopher Siegfried Zielinski. He was a professor of mine years ago, and I found his lectures and presentations were so wonderful. A phenomenologist, German, obviously, and what he would do is he wouldn't have a thesis. He wouldn't talk about what anybody should get from what he's presenting, but he would just present an artifact and he would say what it is, and then he would present the next artifact and say what that was. And of course he designed the lectures and presentations so that you would kind of conclude a story from it, but instead of telling you, like what most, I say, like professors might do, he would just let you experience it, yourself. And so I can't help but think about this kind of phenomenological methodology is sort of very similar as to what you're doing.
I had an undergraduate professor who used to tell me about art in general. She's like, I'm less interested when I would write my artist statements as an undergraduate student. I'm less interested in what the work is about. I'm more interested in what the work is. And that was hard for me to differentiate. I had no clue for years what she was talking about. But then I understood. It's like and this is very common for many younger artists when they're making, is that it's so like the narrative is so long, but it doesn't match what the work is doing.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that there's a disconnect, right? Between the tools in which you are the tools in which you have available to you and the ways that you know how to communicate with them. And so for me, especially, one of my favorite things is actually getting, I know some artists don't love this, but I love getting people to write on my work, people who don't know me to write about my work, because I want to see, and not the ones who like take my artist statement and just rewrite that, but the ones who like actually spend time with the work and like use their own kind of sensibilities to make sense of it. Because then I'm like, oh, or that's what you see? Huh. That's interesting. And it's really interesting when they get the work in a way that I'm like, wow, that's exactly what I intended. But it's also surprising and humbling when there could be a misread. And so like all of that, as an artist, it's so vulnerable to constantly share what's in our hearts and our minds and to tell personal stories in the work and to do all of that. But then when somebody else gets the work, or even if they don't quite get it, but it takes them to a place that they need to go to. That to me is the heart of why I make. It's to find a way beyond language, beyond the normal tools that we have at our disposal to connect and to see what comes from that.
Totally. And that's something that I always tell my students. We always talk about meaning, and I think I keep stressing to them, there is no one meaning. There's always multiple meanings. We all come to this from such different places. We all have different experiences, different things we have read to bring to this. And I said, it's like that's the beauty of work, is that it can do different things. And so I think to hear you as an artist say that, because so many artists are kind of want to hang on to this is what the meaning of the work is. And so it's really refreshing to hear you talk about the way that you're open to misinterpretation too. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
We should always be growing. The moment that we are not, we're dying. So I want the work to grow, and I want to grow as a maker. And so I'm always open to new possibilities for where the work could go, which is why I believe By Way of Revolution and probably Refiguring the Canon, which is another series I mentioned, it has a longer lifespan, a shelf life, because there's more work to be done.
Right.
The archives are endless. The amount of people that I can connect with are growing, and the need for the work, which is something that I think that's where I take myself out of it. I cannot help timing or chance or happenstance. I just have to say, okay, is this of value? If it's not of value, then there's another conversation that might need to be had, that I might have to sort of think about how I can use myself in the form of service. But in the moments that we have now, I just feel like this idea of what a revolution is, what changes, and how we can connect or how we can make space for those who are really doing that labor. I think that's a conversation that can stay on the table.
Thank you.
As we stopped the podcast, we were having this great conversation with Helina about protest and modern protest and activism.
Yeah, and I don't know. I was thinking about the ways in which art, my fear with art in addressing issues of protest is that it becomes symbolic, or just this like symbolic gesture that isn't taken quite seriously because it is art. And that's the point. We don't want to take it too seriously. I'm not a politician. I'm not somebody running for office, right? Like I'm making something in the world and seeing what can become of it and what it can inspire. But I do think that art, and this is why it can be so dangerous in some countries, and some people silence and censor artists and thinkers in this way, is because it can inspire and it can touch in hearts and minds in a ways that books and articles can't, right? Like it's just a different form. And because it can be very subtle and subversive and transgressive, and it can do all of these things, and it can kind of sort of disrupt society in a way. It has power. I love something that this old writing by James Baldwin. He talks about the artists being on the fringe of society. It's a very lonely thing to kind of be on the outskirts of society, but that's where our role is, because we have to poke fun at it. We have to interrogate, and if we are immersed in it, and if we're buying into all that is the status quo, then we don't have that privilege of looking from afar to say, these are where the holes are, this is where we could go. And another quote that I often say is from one of my films, Middle Passage for Dreams, where one of my friends who participated, she said, artists are prophets. We know that a future is coming that hasn't yet come yet, and we're telling people that this is coming. And so the role of the creative it's so beautiful, but I don't want it to be dismissed. And so often it can be, because it's considered trite. It's not valued in our society. We're not.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, valued and not valued at the same time. Right. But it is the role of the artist to kind of, see things differently and reveal things differently than are told to people. It's a things that artists show, and not just things that are told.
Yeah, absolutely.
I keep saying in many of these podcasts, I keep thinking about it as making visible, bringing things into visibility that have not been brought into visibility. And this idea of being like the whole idea of radical democracy, with Chantal Mouffe, and this idea that there is always an outside, and that difference is what we should be celebrating, and not consensus. And so we've thought about democracy as being consensus, but actually it's about being radical and being always on the outside. There will always be an outside, and we need to keep incorporating that outside and listening to those voices that are on the outside. So I think artists, if you're talking about radicality, I think artists can be thought of it in that way too, as these radical outsiders.
Well, and the radical part is because people that are on the inside have a resistance to listening to what's on the outside. To be open to it, I think, is the challenge. And to see people that they're potentially open to it.
Yeah. And what are the boundaries of inside and outside?
Right. Exactly. That's the bigger question. We've sort of let go of this idea of center and periphery, but then what is inside and outside?
Yeah. A friend of mine, one of my close childhood friends, I was on the phone with her today, and she said, I thought it was the biggest compliment. She's like, "Oh my God, you're so normal to be an artist." I was like, "Normal? I'm so happy you think I'm normal." But the idea that you have to be kind of on the fringe in this way is sort of stereotyped with art.
Yes.
And that we're actually functional, tax-paying citizens that, operate in the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've embraced this idea of, the mad genius artist that I always try to fight when I'm teaching too.
No, not anymore.
Yeah.
Could you just say for the record really quickly that you talked really beautifully about a book and about protests, and I just think that should be included in the conversation.
Oh, so I was saying that Mika White wrote this book, The End of Protest, and what he was suggesting was that protest is less effective these days because we know what it's going to look like. And that we know how to police those protests, we know how to resist those protests. And so he's arguing for other ways of protesting. And so what are the other ways in which we can protest and have our ideas disseminated that aren't traditional, I guess? And I think that your work actually speaks to that in very strong ways.
And when you say other than protest, you mean other than like gathering together and demonstrating?
I mean, exactly. Gathering together in a on the street
In a
with our
traditional
placards,
demonstration,
exactly,
right.
with our placards, walking down the street, shouting our slogans, stopped by the police, brutalized by the police. So what does that look like? And so it really sparked for me this idea of thinking through the possibilities of art and particularly possibilities of performative art. And what that can do as disruption, but other kinds of disruptions.
Mm-hmm.
I love the idea of, you called it a routine, but it could be also a ritual, right? Because everything is quite cyclical. History is quite cyclical. And so these things come up again and then they go away. And then there's some sort of appeasing that happens, or it just gets out of the public eye and out of the media. And maybe it's still always happening. But I think, how can we break one ritual and begin anew? Mm-hmm. And I think with art, there is that, and I refer a lot to ritual, or which is just the repetition of motions or activities or sequence of events. But, how do we disrupt and say, here's a new model?
Yes,
for sure.
And I think that that's ultimately in every kind of revolutionary movement, that's what's wanted, is this new model for living, new model for equality, new model for... It goes on and on.
Yeah.
I'm at a loss, but I'm like, it does go on and on. And so I think that that's a good way of thinking about it. Like, how do we break tradition, break that ritual?
Yeah. And what's at stake? People have to be uncomfortable.
Yes.
People in power have to give some of that power up. I'm always curious, people with lots of power, whether that looks like money or status or racial privilege or whatever it is, green card, citizenship, whatever your power is, what are you willing to do to get uncomfortable when you've made it, quote unquote, to a place of privilege or comfort, and not by maybe anything you've done?
And what are you willing to lose, too?
What are you willing to lose?
Chris Hedges, I don't know if you know who Chris Hedges is. He used to cover the Middle East as a reporter. I think for the New York Times, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And he's very vocal, and he talks about the fact that we are heading down this very dark road, and we all have to give up everything we have, and we all have to fight together to keep what is humanity alive. And I mean, it sounds ominous, but he's a beautiful orator, and he's a beautiful writer, and he really says, until we're all willing to lose everything, we're never going to change anything.
Yeah.
And I think that always sticks with me.
Yeah. So there's risk. I think as an artist every day, I mean, I didn't come from a lot of means to take on this profession. There was risk, and eventually there is, if you keep working, there could be a little comfort along the way. You might get the grant, or you might get the teaching gig or whatever. But to say what I really want to say, I always have to be willing to take that risk.
Absolutely.
And that is getting out of my own comfort zone and opening up my platform and saying, okay, but what I really want, what I'm really committed to, is not necessarily a status climb, but the opportunity to tell the truth. And truth telling is really hard, and it comes with costs, and it comes with risks. But at the end of the day, it feels way better. Feels good. And hopefully it makes some change and some impact, which would be even better.
Thanks. Well, just in the spirit of what is happening here, I'll say that there's 3 women in a podcast studio in New York City, talking about the archive, And it's a great place to be and be able to have these conversations with artists like you, Helina. Tell us about what you have coming up because you have some exciting shows.
Yeah, I have some solo projects that I'll shout out first. I have in the spring of 2024, I think in May, I have two solo projects in New York City, Center for Book Arts, where I'm making with the Center for Book Arts team an artist's book that has some of the archives from By Way of Revolution through my collages. And then at Recess, which is another phenomenal social practice organization where I'll be doing a series of workshops over a month. And then in the Bay Area in San Francisco, in October 5th, right in advance of the national presidential election, I'll be doing an exhibition in partnership with YBCA and MOAD. And right now, touring is a wonderful show called Ethiopia at the Crossroads. That's another group show that I'll mention, which pairs medieval Ethiopian art with contemporary Ethiopian art and has a wonderful narrative weaving through it about just history and the ways in which Ethiopia has always had a living history of art as part of the fabric of its culture. And that's currently at the Walters Art Museum through March 3rd, 2024. We'll travel to Peabody, Essex in the later spring, and then the Toledo Museum in the fall 2024.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
So it was really great to have you here in the studio with us. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really a treat.
It was really great to hear
It's a
you
treat
talk
for
about
us.
your work. Yes. Thank you.
Amazing.
And if you want to find out more about Helina and her work, please visit Helina Metaferia, HelinaMetaferia.com.
Thanks for listening. Please take a moment to hit the like button, rate us, and review the show. It makes a big difference in helping us reach more listeners.
International Arrivals is a fiscally sponsored project of the New York Foundation for the Arts.
Your tax-deductible donations make this podcast possible. Please support us at internationalarrivals.org.
Welcome.
You have arrived at your destination.
Ep12.